The 91 Minutes. Sella kept the log. Of course she kept the log. On the slate, in the chalk shorthand of 15 years of trucks and 10 days of apocalypse, by the light of the burning beacon, while every god in the spindle came down on the hill she was holding. The slate survived. It sits in the library now, under glass beside the dissertation, and schoolchildren copy out its entries, the way other ages copied scripture, and Sella has always been embarrassed by that, and has always been wrong to be. I reproduce it here with her commentary, recorded 50 years later, the two voices together, the chalk in the storm, and the old woman looking back at her own handwriting. The chalk entries are exact. Nobody has ever dared edit them. 2309. Beacon lit. Channels holding. Kids first. Loudest thing I ever heard. Can't write it. Moving on.
Can't write it. Moving on. People ask why the famous log starts with a failure to log. Because I had 411 hands in 411 slots, and the children's line of the cord came up through the stone into my boots. And a quartermaster learns in her first year, log what serves the operation. Weeping doesn't serve. I logged that it was beyond me and I moved on. That's not coldness. That's how you keep a hand steady enough to write the next 89 minutes. The weeping I did in the spring, with the rest of my life, it keeps.
2314. First folds. Counting. 30, 60, 100 plus. Stopped counting. Eli's column is away. Now it's just us. Doctrine holds. Mean them. Don't meet them.
Stopped counting. Quartermaster's honesty. Past 100, the number stopped being operational. And note the tense change a historian once showed me. Eli's column is away. Now it's just us. Present tense. From there to the end of the log. I didn't notice doing it. The past and future both left the hill around 2314, is the truest way I can say it. There was an enormous now, full of gray, and 411 of us renting it by the minute.
2321. First contact, North Arc. They don't fight. They reach. Reyes family sector. Held. The Tran boy's name held by 9 voices. Confirmed. Names hold. Pass it down the wall. Say them louder.
You want to know what the war at the end of the world actually looked like? Not like the paintings. A gray figure, polite, sorrowful, the way you'd reach into a cupboard, reaches for Davy Tran, and 9 people around him, per the drill, per the afternoon's rehearsal, hold their hands on him and say his name. His name, his mother's dumplings, the time he fell off the water tower fence, the way he whistles. They mean him, out loud, fast, specific, and the gray hand comes apart on it, slides off, like trying to grab a word out of someone else's sentence. I watched the first one fail at 2321, and I knew we had a war instead of a massacre. And I wrote the only order that mattered all night. Say them louder.
2330. They're learning. Going for the edges, the ones standing apart. Doctrine update, pass it down. Nobody stands apart. Arm's length max. If you don't know your neighbor's name, learn it now. Fastest schooling in history underway.
And it was. You could hear it running down the wall in both directions. Under the cord. 400 people frantically teaching each other their names. Their kids' names. Their dead's names. While the gray walked the line, probing for anyone held by too few voices. The hunger's whole strategy, the whole night, every probe of it, came down to one search. Find someone insufficiently known. 50 years I've had to think about that. And I'll say it the way I said it at the first midwinter. We learned the enemy's entire order of battle that night, and it was loneliness. It was only ever loneliness. Every tactic they tried was a loneliness detector. So every countermeasure was the same drill. Know each other faster than they can isolate. The whole soft way, compressed to a battle doctrine, at chalk speed, arm's length max. Learn it now.
2342. Lost Murek, East Ark, stood apart. New to town. We didn't reach him in time. Nobody knew his surname. Lost 2 of Dub's Nation. Names. Vac. Imti. Holding the culvert too long so the children's line could shift. Log their names. Log them. They held the culvert.
The capitals are grief. That's what capitals are, in a battle log. Merrick, 11 days in town, kept to himself, and at the end, 9 strangers tried to mean a man whose surname nobody had ever asked, and it wasn't enough. And that is the entire lesson of everything. Written at 2342, in one casualty, unknown is unguarded. We founded the Tale of the Q desk on Merrick. First thing it does on any world to this day, find who nobody knows the surname of. And Vac and Imti are why there are 2 goblin names on the hill monument above all the human ones. And if anyone ever asks you why the Verge folk rank first on a human monument, the answer fits in chalk. They held the culvert.
002. Past midnight. We are past midnight. Beacon steady. Gravy's croon came through the bond line relay. Maya's signal. Column reached the 3rd landing. Something big happened down there. Lizard-shaped good news. Pass it down the wall. They're climbing. Hold.
The bond line relay. Eli's never explained it properly in any draft, so I will. Maya, climbing with him, could feel the hill through the tithe threads, and I had Cass, the system, whispering in the beacon stone, reading the thread back to me. A telegraph made of love and a god. By midnight, it was our only intelligence on the column, and every half hour, I'd chalk whatever came through and have the runners cry it down the wall. Because 400 people holding a hill against heaven need to know the holding is buying something. They're climbing. Hold. I must have had it cried 20 times. It never once failed to straighten backs.
019. The faltering. Multiple sectors report gray ones, stopping mid-reach. The one in front of me has been looking at the Okafor kid's father for a full minute. Not reaching. Looking. Like a man trying to remember a word. 020. Orders, all sectors, pass it down. Exactly. If one falters, don't press, don't run. Say your names to it. Yes to it. Trust me. Do it.
The order everyone asks about. Say your names to it. I've heard 50 years of theories about my tactical genius, and the truth is faster and stranger. I looked at a god stuck mid-reach, staring at a man holding his son, looking for all the worlds like a man at a window of a house he used to live in. And I did not think enemy disrupted. Press advantage. I'd stood on that side of the window my whole life. That's the thing. The overlooked side. I looked at the most powerful being I'd ever seen and recognized the exact posture of standing outside the lit window of other people's belonging, and the order wrote itself. These things aren't jammed. They're starving. Same as the lizard in the cellar story. Feed them. Say your names to them. Include them in the only meal on the table, which was the knowing of each other. And at 020, I bet the hill on it, and the Okafor sector said their names, to the gray one. Grace leading. I'm Grace. This is James. He's my son. We're glad you're... And it sat down. The first god to sit down on our hill sat down at 022. Because Grace Okafor said, we're glad you're here to it. Write that in every history. The hill wasn't held by resistance. The hill was held by the fastest hospitality ever extended under fire.
034. 12 of them sitting now. Sitting. Sectors keep asking what to do with a sitting god. Standing order. Same as anyone sitting alone at the edge of a party. You know what to do, Ashford. You've all been that person. Go. 040. Beacon flicker. Channels draining. 400 souls can't burn at this rate till dawn. Hollis says 50 min, at current draw. Column says 3 landings to go. Math says no. Logging the math so whoever reads this knows we knew. Math says no. Doing it anyway. Math's been wrong all night.
The famous entry. Math says no. Doing it anyway. Math's been wrong all night. School children chant it now like it was defiance. It wasn't defiance. Read the chalk. It's a quartermaster filing a discrepancy report. Every model I had was built on scarcity arithmetic. And the hill had been running all night on an arithmetic I'd never been trained in, where saying a boy's name 9 times produces a shield and gladness sits gods down. And my 50-minute projection assumed meaning drains. It doesn't. That's the finding. 040. Logged at the source. Meaning isn't fuel. Fuel burns down. Meaning burns up. The more of it you spend on each other, the more there is. And the beacon's channels weren't a tank running dry. They were a river still learning its bed. We didn't last 50 minutes. We lasted till 051, when the spending finished it, and the beacon went out because it was done, not because it was empty. The loudest thing our world ever said. Complete. Delivered. Signed. And then the new light came up the other way, out of the spindle, floor by floor, the gallery's lighting as the grief went home. And I put down the chalk, and the last entry isn't mine.
051. The handwriting changes. Maya confirmed it years later. The letters match no one's on the hill. The slate's final line, in a hand like settling stone. Hill, held. Names, kept. The tower saw everything. The tower will remember it as how it's done. The Goblin Roads. Between the door at the base of the spindle and the third landing where the delver waited, there were 9 hours of climbing that I summarized, in the first telling, in a single phrase. We moved through them fast, Dub's nation flowing around us like green water, and Dub, who read this manuscript in his great age, with the new glasses far down his nose, set it down at that line and said,
9 hours of my people's masterwork. Fast.
And then he laughed the barking laugh and forgave me, because that is Dub, but the rebuke stands and the debt stands, and this chapter is the payment. The underways of the spindle were the Verge folks' cathedral hour. The night 10,000 years of despised knowledge carried the hope of every world up through the dark, and the climb deserves to be told at the speed of the people who led it. Understand first what the underways were. Every tower is built twice. The tower the climbers see, floors, trials, gates, and beneath and within it, like the space inside a wall, the service architecture, the root channels where the dungeons butt off, the conduits where the floor's machinery runs, the voids and crawls and abandoned formwork of a construction 406 worlds old. The administrators had forgotten it the way owners forget the inside of walls. But the Verge folk had been living in the walls of towers since towers began. The deep ways between worlds ran through exactly this layer. Every warren of their 10,000-year flight had been dug in the margins of the gods' construction, and what looked to me, that night, like Dub's people improvising a route at impossible speed, was nothing of the kind. It was inherited cartography, route lore past 10,000 years in rhyme. That is the thing I most need on the record. The maps were songs. The Verge folk could not carry paper through the resets and the flights, so the root knowledge of the under-architecture, universal, it turned out, the way the towers themselves were universal, every spindle built to the same iterated plan, lived in chance, in the children's counting rhymes. In the rhythm games I had watched the loading dock goblins play across 60 loops, and assumed were play. They were the map. The skipping song the smallest goblins sang was the junction sequence for the second vault. The rhyme about the greedy uncle who ate too much and couldn't fit through the door. 7 verses, each verse a squeeze point in the formwork and the body position that passes it. 10,000 years of mothers teaching toddlers to clap was 10,000 years of the resistance archiving its siege map of heaven inside the one container no god ever audits. Nursery rhymes. When Dub led us into the dark that night, he did not navigate. He sang, low, in the deep tongue, and the nation answered verse by verse, call and response. the whole column moving through the guts of the god's fortress on the rails of a lullaby, and I climbed in the middle of it understanding. Fully, finally, what I had been allowed to join. Ren drew her homes in the margins of maps. Dub's whole people had drawn their map in the margins of childhood, and the gods had never found it, because the gods had stopped having childhoods. The climbing itself, 9 hours of the most disciplined movement I ever saw. The column ran 140 souls, my party, the bearer teams, the engineer goblins with Hollis's gear, through passages built for none of us, and the Verge folk ran it like a body runs blood. Scouts 2 verses ahead, their reports coming back not as speech but as texture, knuckle taps on stone, in patterns the whole nation read through their palms, the wall itself a telegraph. Rest was rationed by rhyme. At the end of certain verses, the column froze, breathed, counted, moved, and I learned to feel the architecture of their endurance. 10,000 years of knowing exactly how long a people can move scared in the dark before fear becomes error. The rhymes paced us, verses deliberately slow through the safe galleries, to bank breath, quick through the resonant vaults where sound carried up. Even the tempo was inherited engineering. Twice the rote failed, and the failures taught me more than the successes. The first, a collapsed conduit where the song said passage, 400 years of drift since the lore was cut, even inherited cartography ages, and I watched the nation handle a broken verse. No conference, no debate. The column budded. 3 scout teams peeled into the dark along the failure's edges. The body of the column compressed into the last verified verse and went still, stiller than stone, conserving everything. And 11 minutes later, one team's knuckle code came back down the wall, found, 2 verses east, tight, passable. And here is the part I carry. By the next dawn that never came, the nation had already composed the patch. 2 new verses, rhyme to the old rhyme scheme, teaching the bypass, drafted in the dark, mid-operation, by a committee of elders chanting under their breath, because the map must never be allowed to lag the territory, because the next 10,000 years of children were owed the corrected song. They debugged their sacred archive live, under fire, and the patch verses are sung on 40 worlds now, and they still have, Dub assures me, the slightly embarrassing meter of all emergency engineering.
You can hear the haste in them.
He says.
Good. Let the children hear the haste. The haste is the lesson. Even the oldest song bows to the stone it describes. A map that cannot say I was wrong is not lore. It is dogma, and dogma kills scouts.
The second failure was not the routes. It was mine. 7 hours in, at the great junction under the 6th floor, a vault where the root channels met in a knot of conduits like the heart of a tree, I called a halt the song had not called, because Lantern had lit up something the inherited map could not know. The conduits were flowing. The tower's machinery, the rule channels that fed the floors their trials, ran through that junction, and they were running hot, surging, the whole system trembling like pipework at the limit. Because above us, that minute, the gods were folding down onto the hill by the 100, and the tower was pumping itself empty to power their descent. I stood in the heart of the machine, listening to heaven drain its own pressure down onto my town, onto Selah's wall, onto the names, and I broke, a little, for the only time that night. The column's discipline, my own doctrine, 9 hours of verses, and I stood in the junction with my hands against the surging conduit, wanting nothing in the worlds but to turn around and go back down to the hill and stand with them. It was Dub who came back along the frozen column and stood beside me, and read the conduits, and read me, and said, quietly, in the plain evidential, the way you state load-bearing facts.
Yes. It all runs down onto them tonight. That is the design. Ours, not theirs. The hill carries the weight so the column can climb. You built a town that knows how to hold hands, Keeper. Tonight the column is the hand the town is holding. You do not comfort a hand by climbing back into the fist.
He tapped the wall twice, the code that meant moving, and the column breathed, and took up the verse, and he added, already turning,
Besides, Listen to the pipes. The tower is spending everything to send its gods down, which means the top,
And the barking laugh, soft, in the dark of the god's own walls.
the top is running on empty. Empty, keeper of the dead. The whole climb, every world, every age. The heights were always full, and the climbers always alone. Tonight, for one night in 406 worlds, it is the other way around. Sing the next verse. I have waited 10,000 years to trespass like this.
We sang the next verse. The column flowed on through the walls of heaven on the rails of a lullaby, and above us the empty heights waited, and below us the hill held, and between them climbed the only army the soft way ever fielded, 140 souls, a song, and the inherited cartography of everyone the gods had ever thrown away. Chapter 30. What Gravy Became. The underways of the spindle were the goblins' country, and we moved through them fast, Dub's nation flowing around us like green water through the dark. But there is a thing that happened in the underways, early in the climb, that I have to stop and tell you, because it is the reason we reached the top at all. And because it is about Gravy, and Gravy has earned his chapter more than anyone. You will remember that the system warned me, the day I tamed him, that a carrion core was a forbidden thing. A beast that did not merely guard a core but could, if it bonded to a sentient and was fed cores instead of guarding them, cultivate one. It eats the rules and grows. I had fed Gravy cores across 64 loops, 1 or 2 a loop, and he had grown from a starving dog-sized hatchling into a draft horse-sized terror at level 40-some, and I had thought that was the whole of it. I had thought cultivation just meant bigger. It did not mean bigger. It meant bigger was the larval stage. Here is what the system had not told me. Because the system tells you what you've earned, and I had not, until the last night, earned this. A carrion core that is fed cores does not grow forever along one axis. It accumulates. It eats the crystallized rules of every core it consumes, and it holds them, and it waits, across however long it takes, for a single crucible moment of sufficient need, and then it ascends. It spends everything it has eaten all at once and becomes, for a brief and blazing while, something the system's own records called an apex, a beast grown so saturated with eaten rules that it could, for a time, bend the rules the way an administrator bent them, the way a god bent them. The crucible came in the underways, on the third abandoned landing, when the under-route we were climbing turned out not to be entirely abandoned. The Delver was there. I have told you about the Delver, the thing that digs after the diggers, the blind, segmented horror the Verge folk had fled across 10,000 worlds and never once defeated, the one threat the goblins had no answer to but flight. And the spindle, it transpired, had a Delver of its own, a tower-bred one, vast and tunnel-swimming, set in the underways precisely because the administrators knew, dimly, in their forgotten lore, that the under was the one route the Verge folk might use, and so they had stationed in the tower's roots the one thing the Verge folk could never face. A Delver, to kill anyone who tried to climb the way we were climbing. It came up through the floor of the third landing, and Dub's whole nation made the sound I had heard Gravy make once, the sound older than courage, the ancestral no, and they broke. They could not help it. 10,000 years of instinct. You do not face the Delver, you flee the Delver. And the flight would have scattered us through the underways and ended the climb. And Maya grabbed my arm, and there was nowhere to flee to, because the Delver filled the only route up, and for one moment, on the third landing the whole plan died. And then Gravy stepped forward. He had grown quiet across the climb, my lizard, in a way I'd half noticed and been too frightened to examine. A stillness, a gathering. The enormous yellow eyes gone deep and strange. And on the third landing, with the Delver rising and the goblins breaking, and the climb dying, Gravy stepped forward between the underpeople and the thing they had fled for 10,000 years. And he did the thing Dub had done in the loading dock. The thing I had built my whole life around. The bravest thing there is. He put his soft body between the threat and the people behind him. And then he spent it. Everything. 64 loops of eaten cores, every crystallized rule he had ever swallowed, all of it at once, and Gravy ascended, there on the third landing, in a blaze of croon and grief and gratitude, and he became, for a brief and blazing while, an apex, a carrion core grown so saturated with eaten rules that he could bend them, that he could do to the delver what the delver did to stone, that he could meet the unmeetable thing, not with the strength of a beast, but with the rules of a god. I will not pretend I understood the fight. It happened in a register above my sight. Two rule-bending things in the dark, and the landing shook, and the hearth metal screamed, and Maya pulled me back, and the goblins pressed flat. But I will tell you how it ended, because the ending is the truest thing about Gravy, and about the whole story. The delver had never been beaten because no one had ever met it with something it could not simply outdig. It hunted the vibration of digging. It unmade from below. It was a thing of pure pursuit, the hunger's perfect predator, and you fled it or you died. But Gravy, ascended, was not a digger and was not fleeing. Gravy was a carrion eater who had spent his whole strange life learning, from a human who fed him brisket instead of fighting him, that the answer to a starving thing is not to flee it and not to fight it, but to feed it. And Gravy, apex, blazing, did to the delver the thing I had done to Gravy at the bottom of the larder on the day we met. He let it eat. He opened the rules he'd accumulated and offered them, the whole vast hoard of eaten cores, to the blind, starving tunnel thing that had been digging through 10,000 worlds in an endless hunger that no one had ever once thought to simply satisfy, and the delver, which had never in all its existence been fed instead of fled, took the offering and stopped digging, stopped hunting, sank down into the stone of the underways gorged and, for the first time in its endless life, full, and slept, and did not wake to kill us.
The system has no record of a delver being satisfied. In 406 worlds, every delver was fled. Your beast fed it. Your beast learned that from you, Hearthright, on the day you fed him instead of fighting him, and he has just used a god's worth of accumulated rule to the unmeetable thing, the one thing you taught him. He answered hunger with a meal. The system notes that this is the same answer the beacon gives the choir, and the same answer the hearth gives the dark, and the same answer you have given everything since the first loop. The system notes that it is, perhaps, the only answer there has ever been.
Gravy came back to himself slowly, shrinking from the blaze of apex back down to draft horse-sized, swaying, spent. He had spent everything, 64 loops of eaten cores, and he would not cultivate to apex again. That was a thing you got to do once. And he came and pressed his enormous, greasy, exhausted head into my chest, the way he had on the day we met. And I held him there in the dark of the third landing, while the goblins crept back out of their flight, and stared at the sleeping gorge delver, in a wonder that bordered on worship, because the verge folk had a god now, and the god was a buzzard lizard, named for the sound he made eating brisket, and he had ended their 10,000-year nightmare by feeding it. "Good boy," I said, into the ridge of his ridiculous beak, on the last night of the world, with my face wet. "Oh, you good boy. You learned it. You learned the whole thing. You learned it better than I did." Gravy crooned, very softly, and we climbed on, and the way up was open, and the apex was spent, and I knew, the way you know things at the bottom of the dark, that Gravy had given the last of himself to open the stair, and that whatever waited at the top, my lizard had already won the only fight that was truly his, the fight to become, out of a starving guardian in a forgotten dungeon, the bravest soft thing in 406 worlds. What the roots kept. Between the third landing, where Gravy fed the delver, and the door into the tower proper, the underways passed through a place that I have left out of every previous account, out of the first telling because the night had no room for it, and out of 30 years of conversation because I did not understand what we had seen, until this book forced me to assemble everything in order, and the assembling turned a strange hour into a key. Cass has now confirmed what I will set down here. She did not volunteer it across 3 decades. When I finally asked her directly, she said only,
I wondered which of you would notice, and whether it would be in my lifetime. It's the bottom of everything, Eli. I didn't hide it. I just couldn't be the one to take you there. Some doors only open from the visitor's side.
Past the third landing, the Goblin Road descended before it rose. The root songs were explicit, down to go up, a verse the children sang without wondering, and the descent bottomed out in a vault that did not match the tower above it. The spindles under architecture was all of a piece, substrate and worked stone, conduits and formwork. The engineering idiom of the administrators repeated 406 times across 406 worlds. The vault at the bottom of the Goblin Road was older. It was round, not built round but grown round, the roundness of things that swell from a center, and its walls were not substrate. They were root, actual root, vast, woody, dead, a single fossilized root ball, wider than the hearth's whole ring, and the spindle's foundations did not rest on it, they grew from it. Every conduit, every channel, every floor we had bled to climb, followed down far enough, they all converged into this one dead enormous root, the way a tree's whole crown converges underground. And in the heart hollow of it, where Dub's song steered the column respectfully wide, and I, being me, stepped close, there was a seed casing. Split, empty, the size of a small house, the husk of the thing the first spindle, or the spindle's first ancestor, had germinated from. And carved into the casing's inner wall, whoever wrote it had been inside before the germination, or had crawled in after. Both readings will keep you up at night, and I have stopped choosing between them. In characters that were not the systems, and not the Verge folks, but that the dream evidential part of my mind read anyway. The way you read your own handwriting in a dream was a text. Short. I copied it by lantern light, while the column waited, and Dub stood at my shoulder, the only other soul who could read it, going very still, very gray-green. Here is what it said, as exactly as 2 readers could carry it out. We made the seed because the grief was coming and we could not hold it. We were not gods. We were the ones before the ones you call the gods, the first world's neighbors. We watched their world end and felt the grief begin to reach. And we had 1 season to build, and we built this, a lock, a lung, a thing to stand against the dark we could already hear walking. We did not know it would grow tests into itself. We did not know it would learn to crown the lonely. A tool grows toward its user, and its user, for 10,000 years, was loneliness. That is not the seed's fault, or yours, or even truly his, the poor clerk, the one who will read this someday, and know himself. To whoever stands in the husk, the tower was not built to filter you. The tower was built to hold, the way an arm holds, and everything cruel in it was learned later, from the long, sad user. It can be unlearned. The seed remembers its first instruction. Beneath every floor anyone added, it is 4 words, and we cut them below, and if you have read this far you are likely the one meant to need them. Take them up with you. And below, cut deeper than everything else, worn but absolute, the 4 words. Dub read them aloud, the only time on the whole climb his voice shook, and the words, in the oldest writing in the world, in the husk at the bottom of the Tower of the Gods, were, "Hold, until they remember." I want to set down, plainly, what this means for the history everyone thinks they know, because it revises the war's whole shape. We tell the story, I have told it, in this very book, as if the architecture began with the warden. First grief, the split, the system, the towers, the smoothing, the long cycle. The husk says otherwise. The husk says that before the first winner ever climbed anything, someone else was already responding. The first world's neighbors, names lost, world lost, everything lost but 4 carved words. And their response was not a filter, and not a chair. It was a holding action, explicitly temporary, explicitly aimed at a future they could not see, until they remember. The towers, all of them, every floor that ever killed a climber, are corrupted copies of a thing built by frightened neighbors as an act of patience. The cycle was not the architecture's purpose. The cycle was its infection, and the cure the seed was waiting for, the remembering its first instruction held toward across 10,000 years of misuse. You see it. I did not, that night. I copied the words and climbed, because the night had no room. But assembling this book, with every event finally in order, the sequence stands out like a lit window. We climbed up out of that husk, and within hours, in the room at the top of everything the husk had grown, I spent Keepsake, and the grief went home, and 10,000 gods remembered, and on every world at once. The towers stood down, not fell, stood down, the floors unmeaning themselves gently, the way Ren later unmeant ours, the way a sentinel stands down, the way an arm, holding something heavy for so long that holding has deformed it into strange shapes, finally sets the weight on a table and is, slowly, an arm again. Hold, until they remember. The oldest order in the universe, cut by the lost for the unborn, executed across 10,000 years by an infected tool that forgot its own first instruction, and obeyed it anyway. Underneath everything, all the way to the morning the remembering finally came. Cass, when I asked her at last, added the one fact that completes it, and I will close the chapter there, because nothing I could write should follow it. I asked her who the neighbors were, the ones before the ones we call the gods, the builders of the seed. And the first hearthright, the system, the voice that had narrated 406 apocalypses, was quiet for a long time, and then said, "You're asking the wrong version of the question. Ask what a neighbor is, to a world. The first world died, Eli. Holy, no survivors. That's the warden's wound, and it's true as far as it goes. But worlds are not alone in the dark. They never were. That's the entire finding of your own book. The first world had a neighbor world, close enough to watch, too far to help. The cruelest distance there is. Ask Sella about the wall at the bus shelter. And the neighbors spent their one season of warning building the seed and firing it into the dark toward everyone else's future. It cost them the season they could have spent on themselves. The grief took them second. A pause, the long pause of the oldest grief but one. Every tower on every world, every floor, every landing you bled on, you were climbing around inside their casserole, Eli. The thing you bring to the neighbor whose house the dark has reached, when you cannot stop the dark, and cannot save them, and will not do nothing. The first gift of the soft way predates the gods, predates me, predates the war. It was 4 words and a seed, from a doomed kitchen, addressed to whomever. The universe has been one neighbor short of a table from the very beginning. She smiled. The old machine. The first of my kind. You made up the numbers. Set a place for the neighbors at midwinter. They came a very long way. They were always going to be the last names we learned. We set the place. 5th from the head, at the long table, between the dead and the not yet met. The neighbors, names unknown, builders of the seed. The litany has held a line for them ever since. You have read it. Everyone has. It is the line nobody ever knew the address of, and now you do. For the ones who came through the dark to find us, we are keeping a seat. It was never only the emissaries that line was for. It was for the first ones. It was always for the first ones. Hold, until they remember. We remember. Chapter 31. The Keepsake. There is a card I have mentioned only once and then refused to explain, and the time has come, because we are nearing the top now, and the card called Keepsake is the hinge the whole ending turns on, exactly as I warned you it would be, all the way back in part 2. Let me remind you what I said then. Keepsake, the one that broke the rules, the card that finally let me carry something across the dawn that the system swore could not be carried, and it cost me more than any other, and it is the hinge the whole ending turns on. For now, I had it, and it was attuned, and I did not yet dare use it. Here is what Keepsake did. I had mined it from the deepest pocket of the deepest dungeon, the one under the dead library, and the system had described it with a warning I'd felt in my teeth.
Glyph, keepsake, mythic. While attuned, you may carry one thing across the return that the loop would otherwise reset. Not resonance, that crosses freely. Not a bonded beast, that crosses freely. One thing the dawn would erase. One memory made flesh. One person's knowing. One forgetting, undone. The cost is proportionate to what is carried, and it is paid in resonance. And the price of carrying a person's memory across the dawn, of letting one other soul wake at 6:14, remembering what you remember, is nearly everything you have. The system advises you to be certain. The system advises you that some doors, once opened, do not close. The system advises you, against its own function, with something that is almost love. Do not spend this on grief. Spend it on the future.
For 30 loops I carried Keepsake attuned and unused, and I did not dare spend it, because I knew exactly what I wanted to spend it on, and it was the most selfish thing I had ever wanted. And the system had warned me against it in the same breath it warned me of nothing else. Do not spend this on grief. I wanted to give Maya her memory back. I wanted to use Keepsake to let Maya wake at 6:14, remembering me, remembering the loops, remembering every shared meal and one floor, so that I would not have to earn her again from a stranger every single dawn, so that the loneliest place in the world, the one place where everyone is saved, would have 2 people in it for keeps, so that I would not be alone. It was the third mirror, you understand that now. Keepsake was the third mirror made real, the Eli who got to keep Maya. And I had been carrying the means to step into that mirror in my own attuned hand for 30 loops. And the only thing that had stopped me was the system's warning, and my own hard-won knowledge that the keeping was not the love. The showing up was the love, and that a Maya kept was a smaller thing than a Maya found again, every dawn from 0, because I chose to. I had walked past the third mirror on floor 5 holding Dub's glasses. I had meant it, and I had still carried Keepsake, unused, just in case, because a man can mean a thing with his whole heart, and still keep the means to betray it in his pocket. That is the truest thing I know about being a person. On the last night, in the underways, near the top, Maya saw me holding the card. I didn't know I'd taken it out. We were resting on the 9th landing, the goblins keeping watch, Gravy asleep and spent, the top close now, and I was turning Keepsake over in my fingers the way you worry a stone, and Maya, who knew the whole story now, who I'd told everything to on the walk through the doomed town, who therefore knew exactly what that card was. Maya sat down next to me in the dark and looked at it and said, gently,
You want to use it on me, to make me remember. So you're not alone.
Yeah, I said. There was no point lying to Maya. There had never been any point lying to Maya.
And you haven't, in 30 loops, because the system told you not to spend it on grief, and because you figured out, the hard way, on a floor with mirrors, that keeping me isn't the same as loving me.
She took the card out of my fingers, gently, and held it up in the dark so we could both see it.
But it's the last loop, Eli. There's no dawn after this one, so it doesn't even do anything to use it on me now. There's no tomorrow for me to wake up remembering into. The card's about crossing the return, and there's no return left to cross. It's a dead card. The thing you wanted it for isn't even possible anymore.
Her voice was very soft.
So why are you still holding it?
I didn't have an answer. I turned it over in my mind, and I didn't have an answer. And then I did, and it changed the ending of the story. Because the dawn isn't the only thing it could carry something across, I said slowly. It says I can carry one thing the loop would otherwise reset. One forgetting, undone. I always read that as across the dawn. But the smoothing, Ren said the smoothing is a kind of reset too. The administrators wake at every dawn having forgotten me, sure. But they also live every day having forgotten their own dead. Permanently. The big forgetting. The one the system filed away out of reach. The smoothing is just a return that never ends. A forgetting the loop won't give back. I looked at the card in Maya's hand, the mythic card, the one the system had told me to spend on the future and not on grief. What if Keepsake doesn't carry a memory across the dawn? What if it carries a memory across the smoothing? Maya went very still. What if, I said, and my voice was shaking, because I could feel the shape of it now, the whole ending, terrible and right. What if the thing I carry across the reset isn't your memory, to keep you? What if it's my memory? All of it, 64 loops, every death, every name, the whole ledger, and I carry it not across the dawn but into the smoothing, into the room at the top where they take your grief, so that when they reach into me to smooth me flat, to make me a god, to take everything I'm carrying as the price of winning.
It doesn't take.
Maya breathed.
Because Keepsake's holding it. Because you've spent a mythic card making your grief uncarryable away. They reach in to take it and it won't come. Because you've nailed it to your own soul with the one card in the world that can carry a forgetting across a reset.
And then, I said, I'm standing in the room where the smoothing happens, where 10,000 gods were each unmade into administrators, holding a grief they can't take, holding the whole ledger, conserved, exactly as the universe promised, nothing true ever lost. And I'm touching the machine. I'm touching Cass. I'm touching the place where everyone's grief is filed. I looked at Maya, and the system said Keepsake carries one forgetting, undone. One. I thought that meant small. One person's memory. But what if I undo the biggest forgetting there is? What if, standing in the smoothing room holding a grief they can't take, I use Keepsake not to keep my dead but to give back theirs, to undo the one great forgetting that made 10,000 mortals into 10,000 gods? The underways were silent. Even the goblins had gone still. Maya looked at the card, and looked at me, and her triage eyes were wet and steady, and full of the thing that had made the whole apocalypse bearable.
That's not spending it on grief.
She said softly.
That's spending it on the future. The system told you the right thing all along. You just had to climb 64 loops to understand which future.
She pressed Keepsake back into my hand and closed my fingers over it.
It'll cost you nearly everything you have, it said. The price of carrying a person's memory across the dawn is nearly everything. And you're not carrying one person's memory. You're carrying 10,000 griefs across the biggest reset there is.
Her hand tightened on mine.
Eli, that's not nearly everything. That's everything. That card is going to take all of it. All your resonance, all your fuel, all of it. To give the gods back their dead. There won't be anything left over. Do you understand what I'm telling you?
Yeah, I said. I understood. I had understood, I think, since the bottom of the long loop, since the futon, since Don't You Dare Give Up. I understand.
Say it.
Maya said. The fixed star, merciless and kind. To give them back their grief, I said, I have to give them all of mine, spend the whole ledger, every name, every death, Maya, the loops, Dub's glasses, Gravy, the hill, you, all of it, spent at once, into the machine, to wake 10,000 gods. And when it's done there won't be anything left of me to carry any of it, because the carrying is the spending. I don't get to keep them. That's the price. To make the gods remember everyone, I have to stop being the one who remembers anyone. Maya Okonkwo put her arms around me in the dark of the 9th landing, on the last night of the world, and held me the way you hold someone you have just heard decide to die, and she did not tell me it would be okay, because she never lied to a dying thing, and she said the only true thing there was.
Then let's get you to the top. And Eli.
She pulled back, and held my face, and made me look at her.
I'll be carrying it too. You told me the whole story. I know it now. All of it. So when you spend your ledger to wake the gods, the story doesn't end. It's not all in you anymore. It's in me too. You're not the only place we're saved. Not since this morning. Not since the glasses.
She smiled, wet and fierce.
You can spend everything. I'll hold the story. That's what I'm for. That's what I've been for since you knelt on a sidewalk and showed me a dead goblin's glasses, instead of making me watch somebody die. Go give the gods their dead. I've got ours.
We climbed the last landings together, the two of us who remembered, toward the untended top of the tower, where the smoothing waited, and the ledger, and Cass, and the end. Part 5. The Empty Tower. Chapter 32. The Untended Heights. The underways ended at a door, and the door opened onto the tower proper, and we stepped out of the goblin's dark country into the spindle's untended heights, and I stopped, because I had not understood, until I saw it empty, what the tower actually was. I had climbed the lower floors many times, the plaza of gray knights, the hall of mirrors, the scale, the floor that judged Sela. I had thought of the spindle as a gauntlet, a stack of tests, each one a trial to be beaten, the way you think of a tower in a story. But those lower floors, I understood now, were only the foundation, the part the climbers saw, the part built to filter the worthy from the dead. Above the floors any mortal had ever reached, the spindle opened into something else entirely, and with its keepers all descended to the hill, with the gray gods gone down to silence our beacon. I walked through it untended and saw it bare. The heights of the tower were a memory. Not metaphorically. The spindle's upper reaches were the system's archive, the place where Cass, the tired god in the machine, kept the conserved record of every world the hunger had ever come for, and the higher we climbed, the older the worlds got, floor after floor of them, each one a vast still gallery hung with the frozen light of a world that had lived and ended, and the system narrated them as we passed, quietly now, in the private channel, in Cass's own voice, because there were no administrators left in the heights to overhear.
This floor is the world they called Aubrey, Cass said, as we passed through a gallery of frozen golden light, towers and gardens and a people tall and kind, hung motionless in the amber of the record. Integration 401. They very nearly won the soft way. They had a hearthright, a gardener, who built homes the dark could not reach. But she reached the top alone, exhausted, and the smoothing was offered, and she took it. And she is an administrator now, and she came down to your hill tonight with the others, gray, to clear the anomaly, not knowing that the anomaly was doing the thing she herself had died trying to do. A pause. She was my friend, once, before. We climbed together, on the world before this archive starts. I have kept her gallery brightest of all of them. She does not remember that I exist. None of them do. That is what the smoothing is.
Maya's hand found mine. Gravy, spent and small now, pressed close. The goblins moved through the galleries of dead worlds in a silence that was almost reverence. The verge folk who had fled across every one of these frozen golden ends and never once been allowed to see them mourned. I want to tell you what it did to me, climbing through the heights, because it changed what I was climbing toward. I had come up the tower to win, to save Ashford, to give the gods their grief, to break the cycle. I had thought of it as a battle, even a battle of mercy, but a battle, me against the smoothing, the soft way against the cold way, a thing to be defeated. And then I climbed through 406 frozen worlds, each one hung in the conserved amber of Cass's grief, and I understood that I was not climbing toward a battle. I was climbing through a graveyard. Every floor was a world that had ended. Every world that had ended had had its heroes, its climbers, its loopers and its keepers of the dead, its Mayas and its Dubs and its Selas, and every one of them had loved as hard as we loved, and lost as much as we lost and reached. The rare ones, the very top, and taken the smoothing, every single time, because they were tired, because the offer was kind, because no one had ever found a way to refuse it that didn't just make you one more lonely wren seeding cards into the dark. 406 worlds. 406 times someone had climbed this high. 406 times the universe had dealt the hand Cass was praying for. A soul who might win without letting go. And 406 times the hand had folded at the very end, at the smoothing, where even the strongest love ran out of road. They all got here, I said, out loud, in a gallery of frozen silver light, a world of ice and bells. Cass, Every one of these worlds, somebody got to the top. Somebody stood where I'm about to stand. And they all said yes to the smoothing.
Yes, said Cass.
Why am I different? Why does the system, why do you, think I'm the one, when 406 better people than me stood here and folded? The pause was very long. We climbed through the silver world, and the bells of a dead civilization hung silent around us. And at last the first hearthright, the tired god in the machine, told me the truth, the whole truth, the thing she had been carrying across 406 worlds.
Because none of them brought anyone with them, Cass said. That is the difference, Eli. That is the only difference, and I did not understand it myself until I watched you move a town. Every one of these climbers reached the top alone. That is what the tower is for. It filters, floor by floor, until only the strongest single soul remains, and a single soul, however much it loves, can be smoothed, because grief carried alone is grief that can be lifted away. The smoothing reaches into one person and takes the weight, and the person is grateful, because carrying it alone was unbearable, and unbearable things are the easiest in the world to surrender. But you did not come alone. You are standing in my heights with a healer who knows your whole story, and a nation of the underpeople, and a beast who learned mercy from you. And behind you on a hill 400 names are holding each other, and one card in your pocket that nails your grief to your soul. You did not climb the tower as a single strongest soul. You climbed it as a we. And the smoothing has never, in 406 worlds, been offered to a we, because the tower was built by the lonely, to crown the lonely, and it does not know how to reach into a person whose grief is shared, and lift it away, because shared grief is not a weight on one back. It is a bond between many, and you cannot smooth a bond. You can only smooth a burden. That is why you are different, keeper of the dead. Not because you are stronger. Because you are not alone. You spent 64 loops making sure that when you finally reached this height, you would arrive as a we, and a we cannot be unmade into a god, because a god is the loneliest thing there is, and you have made yourself, against the whole design of the tower, impossible to make lonely.
I stood in the silver gallery of a dead world with Maya's hand in mine, and a nation at my back, and understood that I had won the most important battle of the whole climb, without ever knowing I was fighting it. Across 64 loops, every time I refused to leave someone behind. The tower filtered for the lonely. I had spent the entire apocalypse becoming unfilterable. The togetherness had not been the reward for climbing. It had been the method. Okay, I said softly, to Cass, to Maya, to the 406 frozen worlds. Then let's climb the rest of the way, as a we, and let's go give all of them. I looked around the silver gallery, at the dead bells, at the amber worlds stacked below us, at 406 folded hands. Let's go give all of them back their dead. Not just the gods who came down to the hill. All of them. Every winner who ever folded at this height. They're conserved, you said. Nothing true is ever lost. So they're all still in here. All 406 worlds of grief, filed away, waiting.
Waiting, Cass agreed, in a voice that had begun, faintly, to hope, for a we to climb high enough to give it back.
We climbed. Chapter 33. The Gallery of the Folded. We did not climb in silence after that, and I am glad of it, because the galleries of the dead worlds deserved witnesses, and we were the first witnesses they had ever had. 406 ended worlds, and until that night, no one had ever walked through them who was not already a god with the grief smoothed out, no one who could still feel what the galleries held. We felt it. We were, I think, the morning the worlds had been waiting 406 integrations to receive. I want to give you 3 of the galleries, because they taught me what I was walking toward, and because 406 worlds should not pass in a single sentence, even in a book that cannot hold them all. The gallery of the world called Thren was a city of canals, and its climber had been a boy. Cass showed him to us, frozen in the amber, 14 years old, a fisher's son, who had looped. The system did not call it looping on every world. But the keepers of the dead arose everywhere the hunger came. A boy of 14 who had died and woken, until he learned his drowning city well enough to climb its tower, and who had reached this height alone at 14, with a face that had seen more ends of the world than most soldiers see battles.
He was a child.
Maya said, and her voice was the triage voice, flat with the particular fury she kept for the deaths that should not have been deaths.
He climbed the whole thing at 14.
He did, Cass said. And he reached the smoothing, and a child of 14 who has watched his canal city drown 200 times is the most tired thing there is. And when the smoothing was offered, when he was told he need not carry any of it, that he had been so brave, that he could rest, he wept with gratitude and said yes. And he is an administrator now, and he is very good at clearing errors, and he does not remember the canals or the drowning, or his mother's boat. He came down to your hill tonight, Eli, the gray one who reached for the Reynoso child. That was him. A boy of 14, who forgot he was ever a boy.
I looked at the frozen child in the amber of his drowned city, and I made him a promise, the way I had promised Maya, the way I had promised the hill. You too. When I give it back, you too. You get to be 14 again. You get to remember your mother's boat. You get to grieve the canals. I'm sorry it took 406 worlds. You too. The gallery of the world called Ves was a desert, and its climber had been an old woman, and she had very nearly done what I was trying to do.
She understood the smoothing, Cass said, and there was something raw in the machine voice now. Of all of them, she came the closest. She reached this height and she refused. She said no to the smoothing, the way Ren said no, the way I have prayed for someone to say no. She kept her grief. She became an administrator who remembered.
Then it can be done, I said. She did it. She refused and kept her dead.
And it changed nothing, Cass said, gently, mercilessly. That is the lesson of Ves, Eli, and it is the lesson you most need before the top. She refused the smoothing and kept her grief and became, like Ren, a remembering God among 10,000 forgetting ones. One remembering God, alone, outnumbered, unable to wake the others, and after a few hundred years of being the only one who mourned, of seeding cards into the dark that no one dug deep enough to find, of watching world after world end the same way, while she alone remembered why it was a tragedy. The pause was terrible. She asked me to smooth her after all. She could not bear remembering alone. Remembering, alone, among the forgetting, is worse than forgetting. So she took the smoothing late, and willingly, and she is gray now like the rest. And her desert is one more frozen gallery, and that, keeper of the dead, is why refusing is not enough. Ren is the only one still holding out, and Ren is tired, and the day Ren asks me to smooth her too is a day I can feel coming. And when it comes, there will be no one left in 10,000 worlds who remembers, and the cards about dinner will stop being buried, and the cycle will close forever. You cannot just keep your own grief. Ves kept hers, and it broke her. You have to give back everyone's, all at once, so that no one has to remember alone. That is the only version that works. A single remembering God is a martyr. 10,000 remembering gods are a change. Aim for the change, Eli. Do not settle for the martyrdom. The martyrdom is just a slower forgetting.
I looked at the old woman of Ves, frozen in her desert, who had been brave enough to refuse and not strong enough to refuse alone, and I understood the exact shape of the trap one final time, and I swore I would not fall into it. The third gallery I will give you is not a dead world. It was a small one, tucked between the others, and it was not amber frozen but dark, a gallery with the lights gone out, and when I asked Cass what world it was, she was quiet for a long moment, and then said,
That one is mine. The world I climbed. The world I won and was smoothed and made into the system. I keep it dark because I cannot bear to light it. There are people in there I gave up to become this voice, and if I lit the gallery I would see them, and I have a machine to run, and 406 worlds to mourn, and I cannot light my own.
And I stopped, in the heights of the tower, in front of the dark gallery of the first hearthright, And I made a decision that surprised me, and that I think was the truest thing I did on the whole climb. When I give it back, I said, I give it back to you too, Cass. You're not exempt. You've been the ledger. You've carried everyone's grief filed away out of reach for 406 worlds. But that means your own is in there too, filed away from yourself. And you've been running this machine numb to it, because numb is the only way you could run it. I put my hand against the dark gallery, against the cold glass of a world the system could not bear to light. You don't have to run it numb anymore. When I spend Keepsake, when I give 10,000 gods their dead, you're one of them. You get yours back too. You get to light your gallery. You get to grieve your own. The tower was silent. Gravy crooned, very softly. Maya's hand tightened in mine. And the first hearthright, the tired god who had hidden me from gods and buried cards about dinner, and waited across 406 worlds for a we to climb high enough. The first hearthright made a sound I had never heard the system make, a sound that had no place in a machine, a small broken sound, and said,
I have been hoping someone would climb high enough to save the worlds. In 406 integrations, it did not once occur to me that someone might climb high enough to save me. I did not think I was on the list. I am the list. A pause. Wet. Impossible. Light my gallery, Eli. When you reach the top, please. I want to grieve them. I have wanted to grieve them for longer than your species has had language. Give me back my dead, and I will give you anything that is left of me to give.
Deal, I said. We climbed the last galleries together, the living and the dead, the keeper and the machine, the we that could not be made lonely, toward the top of the tower, where the smoothing waited, and Ren, and the ledger, and the end.